Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome and a céad míle fáilte to today's University College Cork Jean Monnet lecture series. This is the first time that we have run the series online, so I'm delighted to welcome what is actually a very large audience today. We've colleagues joining us not just from Cork and Ireland, but also from across the United Kingdom, and from as far away as the US and Canada and different parts of Europe. So you're all very, very welcome today. In fact, I think, Anand, you might have a bigger audience than the audience that we had when Tony Connolly delivered his lecture a number of years back. This lecture series is This lecture series is supported by the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet programme. It was interrupted last year, unsurprisingly, by the pandemic. And in fact, today's speaker, Professor Anand Menon, was due to be in University College Cork in May of last year to deliver this lecture. So we will make sure, Anand, that you have a chance to come to Cork. I know you've never been before, so we look forward to your visit as soon as the situation allows. But on that note, I really am genuinely delighted to welcome Anand Menon to deliver the first online Jean Monnet lecture of 2021. I'm not sure that there is any greater authority than Anand when it comes to all things Brexit. He is the Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs at King's College London, but perhaps most significantly, he's also the director of the UK in a Changing Europe project. And the UK in a Changing Europe is a non-partisan reference point, an impartial reference point for those who are looking for information and analysis about UK and EU relations. Earlier this week, actually, the organisation published a bumper report which was looking at Brexit and beyond, with contributions from, I think, over 70 scholars from across these two islands. So it's a very comprehensive and a very important piece of work. So congratulations to you and all the team, Anand. But aside from his duties with the UK in a Changing Europe, Anand is also co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of the European Union. He's a co-author of Brexit and British Politics. And he is a trustee, a fellow, and a member of a range of different organisations, including Full Fact, the European Policy Centre, the European Council on Foreign Relations, and also Chatham House. He's a very regular contributor to both print and broadcast media. And in fact, this evening, Anand is going to be on the BBC's Question Time panel. So if you don't get enough of him this afternoon, there's an option for your evening viewing. Well, today's lecture discusses Brexit, what happened and where are we headed? And here in Ireland, we have I suppose, a particular perspective on Brexit. And naturally, that probably means that we look at it through a very specific Irish lens. And I think that this means that we don't always maybe fully understand and appreciate some of the factors and the logic and the dynamics and even the nuance, perhaps, which explains and accounts not just for the Brexit vote itself, but also for the subsequent negotiation period and what happens from here on in. So we very much look forward to your insights today, Anand. Following the lecture, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. We'll be using the chat function for questions. So please feel free to post any of your questions or your comments to the chat during the lecture or after the lecture. I must advise as well that we're also recording today's event. And my colleague, Jean O'Callaghan, is looking after the technical side of things. If you're having any technical issues, please post a comment for Jean into the chat and she will be able to assist you. So now that the housekeeping is out of the way, I am delighted to pass the floor to Anand and to thank him enormously for his generosity and his engagement today. Thanks, Anand.
Thank you so much, Mary. Firstly, please do not put comments on the lecture during the lecture in the chat, because that might put me off if they're really negative. So just put positive ones there. Secondly, as a good advertising executive, I've stuck a link to the report that Mary mentioned in the chat so you can download it. Thirdly, I'm seriously want to come to Cork. I was very, very excited to make my first trip there. So if we could make it happen. As Mary said, this is the first of 2 virtual trips to the island of Ireland today. And I guarantee you, however hard your questions are, this is going to be the most enjoyable one of the 2 by a country mile. Anyway, enough of that. What I'm going to do today is, Jean, can you put the slides up? We're coordinating across the sea with slides today, so it's going to be a very impressive feat of technology. So if we can just go on to the next one, Jean, and which just explains basically what I'm going to go through today, what happened, what the TCA is all about, what it heralds for the future, what the impact will be economically and politically. And as Mary hinted, this is going to be a very sort of British, perhaps even Anglo-centric approach. I'm not going to talk very much about, I'm certainly not going to talk very much about the Republic of Ireland. I'll talk a little bit about Northern Ireland, not much, and not much about Scotland, but I'm very, very happy to take questions on any of those things afterwards. But basically, let me start with a quick historical recap on how we got to where we got to. Brexit proved to be a very messy and a very, you can go forward one if you want, Jean, it's just, I think, yeah, just keep on that one. Brexit was a messy process for many reasons. It was a messy process first, I think, because, you know, surprise, surprise, leaving the European Union is a very difficult, very messy thing to do. It's a very difficult and very messy thing to do, whoever you've got in charge and however big the majority they have in Parliament. We were cursed in the United Kingdom by having a pretty indecisive prime minister to try and shepherd us through most of the process. And indeed, for most of her time in office, she was trying to do this on the back of a minority government that was fundamentally unstable. And, you know, Theresa May made most of the major blunders during the Brexit process, I would argue. But this slide here is a picture from an article that Jill Rutter and I wrote for Prospect. But if you go back over the Brexit process and you ask yourself, why is it that Brexit ended up with the kind of hard Brexit that back in 2016, no more than 30 or 40 people in the Conservative Party wanted, no one else wanted at all. There are plenty of culprits there who, by their actions, deliberately or not, helped to undermine the prospects of a far closer relationship between the UK and the European Union than we ultimately ended up with. I'm not going to spend time on it. I mean, I think the article is still free to download, but we go through various aspects, whether it is those people angling for another referendum who voted against soft Brexit options, whether it was the ERG itself, whether it was the Nicola Sturgeon pressing for an election that she knew, I think, Boris Johnson might well win, but she equally knew that it would help her party, but therefore hastened a hard Brexit of the kind that her party was opposed to. There are a number of suspects, so a number of missteps made. But I think fundamentally, the other issue about the United Kingdom throughout all of this was that the country was profoundly divided. If you could stick the next one on, please, Jean. Parliament itself was divided. This next graphic shows these are the indicative votes that were held in the UK Parliament. And if anyone wants, we can just, Jean can just email the slides to everyone afterwards if you want the slides. There was a majority against everything, is the simple fact of Brexit in the British Parliament. They couldn't summon a simple majority for any Brexit outcome. And this doesn't mean that Parliament was not doing its job properly, because as the next slide shows, Parliament, in being divided and indecisive and unable to come to any conclusion about Brexit, was faithfully reflecting the views of the British public. There was no majority in the British public for any Brexit option. And so we were confronted with the most divisive political issue of our time, but in a situation where we had a government trying to govern with a minority, but where there was no majority for any of the Brexit outcomes. And that, I think, helps explain why the process proved quite as difficult, as messy, as bitter, as bad-tempered, and as potentially as scarring into the medium term as it did. So turning now to what we actually ended up with, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. You can flick on one, please, Jean. Sorry about this. What does the Trade and Cooperation Agreement do? Well, it gives us tariff-free trade subject to rules of origin. It does far more on security cooperation, certainly, than I thought it would, which is a good thing. It deals with fisheries for the time being. It deals with aviation, it deals with road transport, it deals with energy, it deals with social security. So it's an ambitious treaty which covers a lot of ground. And the first thing worth saying about it is the fact of having a treaty at all is a very big deal. Had the talks broken up in acrimony, as I thought at the start of December that they might, we would have ended up not just trading on WTO terms and all that that represents in terms of disruption and costs and tariffs, but also I think we would have ended up with a very damaging diplomatic standoff between the UK and the 27 that would have made it very, very difficult for us to think about working together, not just on these issues, but on security within NATO, on environment within the context of COP26. It would have caused a rift in diplomatic relations that would have been hard to overcome and would have been absolutely dreadful in terms of our practical ability to work together. So let us not, because I'm about to turn to what the deal doesn't do and to criticize it, but let us not forget what the fact of having a deal means. However, if we can go to the next one, please, Jean. It's worth pointing out the very big gap. I'm sorry, that's dreadfully small. Some of you are younger than me and can actually read that. The very big gap between what this deal does and what membership did. The missing elements that we sort of are learning about day by day in the newspapers as people like, Roger Daltrey learn what should have been bleeding obvious to anyone who was following the negotiations from the start. That is to say, if you're a musician, you can't go to the European Union and play concerts, not just because you'll need a visa and you'll also need to buy a license for your guitar, but also because if you're doing a tour, the rules of cabotage mean that you're going to have to come back after 2 stops in continental Europe because your coach can't stop in more than 2 places on one trip unless you use a French haulage firm, which means that you take a tour bus from the UK to France and then jump on a French coach. So there are all sorts of practical ramifications of this deal that are now becoming obvious. The absence of anything much to do with services. There's a niche agreement on the practice of English and Welsh law, but if you think about financial services, if you think about architects, if you think about accountants, there is no visa-free travel. If you go over there to work, you will need to have a visa. There is no mutual recognition of qualifications, which means if you're an architect who's used to bobbing over to Portugal and saying, okay, I'll do some work here, you're going to have to apply for new qualifications if your qualifications are not recognized by the Portuguese authorities. So tremendous disruption to trade in services, but also worth saying, even though this is a deal that deals with goods, a significant amount of disruption when it comes to goods as well. Why? Because even though there are no tariffs, as the British government's own modelling from 2017 that was spectacularly leaked by BuzzFeed and then denounced by the ministers who'd commissioned it, showed, the biggest drag on the economy of Brexit isn't tariffs, but non-tariff barriers. And businesses exporting goods now face the need to get certification of their goods inside the European Union. They face slower transit times for their goods across the border because of the queues and the paperwork, which means that for the car industry, just-in-time supply chains will simply not function like they used to. And it will mean paperwork. Things like customs declarations. Make UK, which is the trade organisation for British manufacturing, estimated that the annual cost to UK firms of customs declarations would be in the region of £6 to £7 billion. So you might just say, well, it's simply filling in a form, big deal. If you're Ford, if you're Honda, that's an awful lot of forms and they have to be filled in right, otherwise the truck will get held up at the border. So this is a very, very far cry from membership, even though you could argue that it's a significant improvement on no deal. And it is not an end point, is the final thing worth saying. Financial services have not been agreed yet. The EU gets to make a decision on adequacy, and if you want my bet, they will not be very generous when it comes to adequacy, not least because the UK government has spent all its time since Christmas Eve saying we're going to change all our financial services regulations so we can compete more effectively with the European Union. Well, that's great, but don't then expect the European Union to ease your access into their market if they think of you as a regulatory competitor. There's a danger that the same thing might happen with data. We have a 6-month grace period before the adequacy decision on data. But if it looks, for instance, as if the UK is planning to liberalise its data sharing arrangements with third parties in other trade deals, do not be surprised if the European Union turns down the adequacy bid on the grounds that their data cannot be trusted with us because we might be sharing it with third parties with whom we have other trade agreements. And that is not just crippling for a number of businesses in terms of your databases of European customers, it is also going to have profound repercussions for police cooperation, which of course hinges to a significant degree on access to European databases. There is of course still the fact that we have to implement what we've agreed. This is a long agreement. It's an agreement written in haste. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it wasn't profoundly internally contradictory. We won't figure out whether it is or not till a lot of its clauses have been argued out in front of the courts. Then there is, of course, the rebalancing clause that gives either side the right to retaliate in the event that the other side is seen to be gaining an advantage in terms of trade from reducing regulatory standards. That will be an interesting one to watch. We might see that coming up with financial services regulation. We might see it with the government talking about revisiting the working time directive and perhaps revising the controls on working hours. There are all sorts of areas where the European Union might look at what the UK has done and decide to apply tariffs. So it's a tariff-free deal, yes, but in the event that we use the freedoms that Brexit was meant to have procured for us, tariffs might be a necessary conclusion of that. And finally, of course, fisheries, and however ridiculous you may think it is, fisheries nearly stalled the whole process, will be renegotiated in 5.5 years' time. So we have that fight to look forward to. And the deal itself is up for review every 5 years. So Brexit isn't done. We've simply entered a new process of Brexit. And for many British civil servants, they're going to start to feel very Swiss, i.e. locked in a permanent cycle of negotiation with their EU counterparts, either about updating or about implementing or about renegotiating the enormous trade deal that they've just signed. If we can go to the next slide, please, Jean. Oh, sorry, that was the next slide for the last bit. So the next slide, please. Sorry, my fault. Let me talk a little bit then about what this means for the UK economy and what it might mean in practical terms for the UK before turning to the bit I'm more comfortable with, which is the politics. The first thing to be said is that Brexit has already had an impact on the UK economy. If you could do the next one, please, Jean. This is some work that is done regularly by John Springford at the Centre for European Reform. And what they do, if there are economists amongst you who recognise this method, is they basically use a doppelganger. They choose a basket of economies that historically have performed very similarly to that of the United Kingdom, and they track their progress in the period since the Brexit referendum, and they track the progress of the UK economy. And there you see a 2.5% gap between the doppelganger and the UK economy, which very strongly hints, if nothing more than that, that there has been a Brexit impact on the UK economy already. And you could easily surmise where that impact comes from. It comes from firms anticipating that trade will get harder and diversifying away from the United Kingdom, and more fundamentally, I think, it comes from lost investment. A number of firms that have simply said there is absolutely no point pouring huge amounts of investment into the United Kingdom until we know what its trading relations with the European Union are going to be like. It might be actually that the signing of the Brexit deal, though the COVID context might change that significantly, but it is conceivable that we see an unleashing of a certain amount of pent-up investment in the first few months of this year as companies, perhaps manufacturing companies, think, okay, we've got a deal, we can make this work, we can start investing in plant again. And if you want to see whether that's happening, keep an eye on investment figures, in particularly the aerospace and automobile industries, which I think will be the first ones to show any signs of this kind of investment taking place. Then, of course, there is the, read my mind, Jean. Then again, next, of course, there is the actual implications of the deal itself. And we've modeled this, and I know these figures are eye-watering. There's nothing I can do about that, I'm afraid. That's just what the figures say, is that even with a deal, you're going to get significant hits to levels of trade between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And if trade falls by those amounts, you will get a hit to the domestic economy. The sort of average of the predictions of credible economic outfits is that the UK economy will grow slower to the tune of about 7% of GDP than it would have done had we remained in the single market in the customs union over the next 10 years. That is a massive number. 7% of GDP is huge. It's worth bearing in mind. Actually, I think, well, let's do the next slide first, if we can, Jean, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of that. The COVID impact on the British economy is massive, as you can see from that orange line, but short-lived, because it is growth that we will get back when the economy comes back, when employment levels go up again, when people are allowed out of the house, we all go shopping. Personally, I think I might go to a restaurant for the first 100 days of being allowed out of this house. When we start spending that pent-up cash, we will recover. There is a debate amongst economists about how quickly and when and how long it takes us to get back to pre-pandemic levels, but there is a broad consensus that we will. Whereas if you look at Brexit, even the middle line is a rough modelling of the Johnson Brexit deal. Even with the Johnson Brexit deal, the sad outcome is that the impact of Brexit on the British economy is significantly greater than the impact of COVID on the British economy in the long term. And just to come back to my earlier point, next one please, Jean, I mentioned earlier those leaked government forecasts. The reason why this looks like it's a bit dirty is because it was a bit dirty. I think it was dropped before it was photocopied by BuzzFeed. Again, we can share these slides so you can look at them in more detail. The point here is the benefits of Brexit as modelled by the government itself are above the line. Okay, and they come benefits from regulatory freedom and benefits from signing trade deals with all the countries you see under the figure. Everything under the line is a loss, and those blue and white lined areas are the impact of non-tariff barriers. That is to say, even though we don't have tariffs, quite a lot of that negative impact of Brexit is still there. And the important point, I suppose, to take away from this is however many trade deals the United Kingdom signs, unless the fundamental nature of international trade changes, that is to say, until we get to a stage where geography isn't the single greatest determinant of trade volumes, then Brexit will continue to be a drag anchor on the British economy. But if I can just have the next slide, please, Jean, sorry. But, and it's a big but, there are two things here. The top one is a graph that shows that the British people increasingly came to think that Brexit would be bad for the British economy. The bottom one is the YouGov tracker asking the question, do you think the decision to leave the European Union was the right decision or the wrong decision? The blue line is wrong, the green line is right. So there's a majority in the United Kingdom that think voting to leave the European Union was the wrong decision. However, as expectations about the economic impact of Brexit became progressively bleaker, there wasn't a massive swing. This didn't lead to a massive change of opinion on the part of Leave voters who suddenly thought, oh my God, this might not be so good. I might have to reconsider what I did. Now, there are a number of possible reasons for this. One is they don't believe the figures. They simply don't believe the forecast. They think it is all remain a lies. And there is evidence of that the polarization of UK society is so deep that there's a lot of that about. But I think also the other fact is that there were people, and there are a significant number of people who were willing to countenance an economic impact in order to get what they wanted, which was leaving the European Union. Now, all sorts of open questions about those, whether they were thinking about this in aggregate, i.e. whatever happens to the aggregate economy won't really impact on me, and what stage in their own, in the development of their own personal finances, they will think or might think, oh God, actually he didn't realize it would be that bad. There are lots of anecdotal things around on social media of people saying I voted for Brexit, but I think we're a long way from that. And I think what this slide shows, and it's very important, is the rather simplistic assumption made by many Remain supporters in the United Kingdom that as soon as Brexit had happened, and as soon as we saw a bit of disruption at ports, and as soon as we started to feel economic impacts, people would start to change their mind and regret their decision, is simply not true. And I think above and beyond everything else, one of the key reasons why it isn't true is the fact that the Brexit economic impact is not going to be the famous cliff edge that so many people talk about. Cynically, it's not going to be a cliff edge because of that slide from the CER I showed earlier, which proves that we're already a significant way down the cliff, so we have less far to fall. But more seriously, I think rather than the metaphor of a cliff edge, I would use the metaphor of a slow puncture. For those of you who cycle, you'll know that there are two defining characteristics of a slow puncture on your bike. The first is it takes you absolutely ages to realize you've got one. You could cycle for weeks with a slow puncture and you keep going. And if you're me, you keep thinking, God, I'm getting old. I'm getting slower up that hill every day. And it's only when that tire actually looks flat that you turn around and think, oh my God, I've got a slow puncture. So it will be a long time before the economic impacts of Brexit become clear. And so long, in fact, that it will be very, very hard to pin those effects back to Brexit, which is the second defining feature of a slow puncture, which is you can never ever know for certain where you picked it up. So it might well be in 10 or 12 or 15 years time, your average Brit who goes on holiday to continental Europe, having passed through the queue at the non-EU line at customs first, looks around and says, God, these Spanish or Portuguese or French or German people look quite prosperous and their infrastructure is quite good, which is essentially what happened in the 60s when the UK first applied to join. But it won't be a simple eureka moment. And so much would have transpired in the period since the referendum that making a compelling narrative that what you're experiencing now is the economic impact of what happened then, I don't think is going to be politically straightforward. So whilst it is absolutely clear to me that the economic implications of Brexit are negative, we shouldn't assume from those that the political implications are going to follow naturally from those economic impacts. If we can move on a slide. To the politics. There are several things to say about the politics. I'm just reading the question. This is what happens. I'm going to turn the chat off, otherwise I'm going to keep staring at it. There are two things I think that will determine the political impacts of Brexit, and I will talk about immigration and the politics of this in some detail now. The first is the stated ambition of this government to bring about a levelling up of the UK economy. This is something that ministers repeat ad nauseam. The Prime Minister repeats whenever he opens his mouth, that we are going to level up the country. Now, there are several things to be said about this. Firstly, the United Kingdom is in serious need of being levelled up. It is a worthy ambition. Jean, if we can just go on to the next one. If you think in terms of regional imbalances, we are, well, it's one of those league tables we win. The gap between the poorest and richest regions in the United Kingdom are far greater than those in any other member state. In fact, I think if you use productivity as your measure, the gap between the least and the most productive parts of the United Kingdom are about the same in terms of scale as the gap between the most and the least productive parts of the Eurozone as a whole. So this is a big, long-term problem, okay? And it would be hard, all things being equal, levelling up would be hard to deliver within 1, 2 or 3 parliamentary terms anyway, because those levels of inequality have come from 30, 40 years of neglect since the demise of manufacturing industry on a grand scale in the United Kingdom in the 70s and particularly the 1980s. Now, this plays a part in Brexit. If I could have the next slide, please, Jean. That is the map of leave and remain of the referendum. The blue bits are leave, the yellow bits are remain. There's an interesting story tied to this, which I'll start off with actually, which is for those who follow British politics, you might remember Rory Stewart, former Tory Prime Minister, who MP, who stood for the leadership of the Tory party, then stood to be London mayor. And when he was standing to be London mayor, he did an interview with one of the London magazines, and they asked him what his favourite pub was. And Rory, rather curiously, said Pret. Anyway, be that as it may. And then the next thing that happened that was weird was he was subjected to a torrent of abuse on social media from Corbynistas, calling him a liberal metropolitan elitist because he liked Pret. And I remember I went into the office one day and I said, what's all this stuff about Pret being elitist? I don't understand it. I love Pret. And the researchers in the office produced the next slide, which is quite interesting. There are the Prets in the United Kingdom, and there is a striking correlation there, if you're me, I hope there is if they're you, between Prets and Remain voters. Prets exist in young, diverse, urban areas, young, diverse, relatively economically prosperous areas, all tended to vote Remain. Actually, let me say one more comment about Rory Stewart. Rory Stewart, his seat when he was an MP was in the Lake District, and we calculated that he'd have an 18-hour walk to his nearest Pret from his old constituency, which is probably why he decided to run for mayor of London. But the serious point about this is that Brexit itself was a manifestation of a socio-economic divide within the United Kingdom. It was not the only driver of the Brexit vote, but it was one of them, which is why politicians post-referendum have placed so much emphasis on the need to level up the country. But on top of the fact that it was a big task back in 2016 to carry out levelling up, there are two things that make that task even harder. If we go to the next slide, please, Jean. This next thing shows the areas that are in least danger of losing jobs due to coronavirus. And again, you see a correlation between the Leave, between the Remain and the Pret areas. So the economics impacts of COVID, as far as we can tell at the moment, and obviously this is going to be a rapidly changing picture, are likely to be most severe in those parts of the country that are already not doing as well. And then on top of that, if I can have the next one, please, Jean, the impact of Brexit is felt hardest precisely in those same regions. There is almost a perfect correlation by some measures, and this is disputed, economists have different measures of this, but by some measures, there is an almost perfect correlation between the degree to which a region voted Leave and the degree to which its economy is dependent on the European Union for trade. That is to say, the two regions of the United Kingdom least dependent on the EU for trade are Scotland and London, which are the two regions of the United Kingdom that voted most strongly to Remain. But the point of all this is Brexit adds to the problems that the Prime Minister will face in delivering on his core political pledge to level up, because early indications, and these are not definitive by any manner of means, we're going to need to see how this deal works before we come to firm conclusions, but early evidence suggests that Brexit, as well as COVID, will make the levelling up task he has promised to carry out significantly more difficult than it already was. And I think that's the first part of the political challenge confronting the Prime Minister. The second challenge facing the Prime Minister, if we can have the next slide, please, Jean, is whether or not he can maintain a focus in our politics on values issues. For those of you who study political science, you'll know that traditionally politics in the United Kingdom has operated on a left-right axis. So it's an economic axis between those who favour greater intervention in the economy, more redistribution, versus those who favour a smaller state, far less redistribution, lower taxes. That's the left-right axis. What Brexit did was help to reinforce another axis, which was an axis between social liberals and social conservatives. And what the graph on your screen shows is the correlation between that values axis and how you voted in the referendum. The more socially conservative you were, the more likely you were to vote for Leave in the Brexit referendum. Now this matters, and it matters because one of the implications of Brexit has been that it has fundamentally reshaped the social bases of British politics. One of the reasons why over the last few years, in the elections of 2017 and the elections of 2019, we've had such weird results, the Conservatives winning Stoke, Labour winning Kensington or Canterbury, is because the class basis of politics has been eroded and people have voted on the basis of values rather than left-right issues. And in 2019, in December of last year, what the Conservatives managed to do very successfully is create a Leave coalition. 82% of the people who voted for the Conservative Party at the last election supported Leave. Now, for the Conservative Party, it is important to try and maintain that coalition. And to date, if I can have the next slide, please, Jean, they've managed to do so quite successfully. These are meant to indicate the strengths of Remain and Leave identity. It's not a perfect table, because actually what I should have done is indicate that if you ask those same people the strength of their political attachments, do you define yourself as Labour or Conservative, the numbers are lower than 20%. So the point is, at the moment in the United Kingdom, Brexit identities are significantly stronger than political identities. Okay, which will suit the government, because the government is based on a cross-class Brexit coalition rather than a traditional left-right coalition. However, if I could have the next slide, please. This is where the real debates are going to come in our politics. One of the reasons why Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, has been reluctant to talk about Brexit is because he wants to move the debate on to economics for several reasons. One, because if you look at this, what this is derived from some work we did where we sampled MPs, party members and voters and tried to gauge where they stood both on the social liberal, social authoritarian axis and on the left-right axis. This is the left-right one. The point is here that Conservative voters are quite a significant distance away from Conservative MPs when it comes to economic matters. Why? Because many Conservative voters, and if you look at that grey dot are people who switched to the Conservatives from Labour in 2019, the key swing voters. They tend to be people who are social authoritarians, that's to say they are cultural conservatives, but they believe in a big state. They're left-wing on economic issues. Confronting the Conservatives with a battle on economic policy is an opportunity for the Labour Party, because not only are the Conservatives divided from some of their key voters on economic issues, but the Parliamentary Conservative Party itself is profoundly divided. You have the new MPs from the Northern Conservative seats that they won, often for the first time back in December of last year, who are calling for a maintenance of the uplift in universal credit, who are calling for greater state spending, greater investment. And you have traditional Conservatives like Sajid Javid, the former Chancellor, who are thinking out loud, how is it that we get levels of debt under control? How is it that we cut taxes? How is it that we become a traditional Conservative government again? So part of the next few years, part of the story of the next few years is what the terrain on which political battles are fought proves to be. If it's economics, my suspicion is Boris Johnson has a harder task than if he manages to keep triggering the kinds of issues that hold together a values coalition, statues and Black Lives Matter. One of the reasons why the Prime Minister looked so appallingly embarrassed yesterday when he was asked if he thought Joe Biden was a woke president, I'm far too old to understand that term, but I understand what it implies, is because it puts him in a difficult position because of the nature of the coalition he's put together. But I would expect that the Conservative Party will try and talk a lot about issues like immigration, will try and spark fights with the European Union like it has done over the EU representation in London over the last few months, because it needs to keep that coalition together. The big test, the big unknown, the fundamental unknown about the nature of politics, I mean, this is global, not just in the United Kingdom, is what the economic impact of COVID as we move from the public health crisis to the impending unemployment crisis, what that does to politics. How understanding people are about an economic crisis brought about by a pandemic no one could have foreseen, to what extent people start to blame a Conservative government for not doing enough to help the unemployed. ultimately, that will be a fundamental issue. It seems to me at the same time, however, as we recover from the COVID pandemic and its economic impact, Labour need to find a way of coming up with a convincing narrative tying a slow recovery relative to other countries, if that is indeed the case, to the kind of Brexit that the Prime Minister has delivered. And that, it seems to me, will be the sweet spot for the Labour Party, coming up with a narrative that links economic outcomes to prime ministerial decisions, not least in the context of Brexit. So to conclude very, very briefly, there's going to be long-term scarring processes on our economy, and those economic impacts are going to impact on our politics as well. The economic impact is going to stay with us for a long time. It might be subtle, it might be hidden, but it is going to be significant and of a significant scale. The government as a consequence is going to find it harder to deliver on its promises. But one of the great paradoxes, I think, of our politics at the moment is that the Prime Minister, who made such play of his ability to get Brexit done, might need to keep talking about it throughout this Parliament in order to most effectively fight the political battles that he faces. The beautiful thing about Zoom is I have no idea if you're all asleep now, but I've finished. Thank you very much. Oh, Mary, you're muted.
Sorry, you think I'd be used to it by now. Anand, thanks very much indeed. That was really fascinating. And there's a lot of things that struck me actually from that presentation, but I think what really stood out for me is the depth and the strength and the intensity of the way in which Brexit is shaping identity and values in Britain. That's very striking looking at it from this distance, and how that plays into the Conservative Party agenda as well, how it shapes and frames what they want to do and how they want to do it. And I guess it begs all sorts of questions about the stability of the British political system into the future. So there's an enormous richness to what you've presented, and it's really been quite illuminating. So thanks very much indeed for that. I myself have lots of questions, but I might just turn to the chat now and get to a few of those questions, if that's okay with you, Anand. The first question has come in from Brian Turner. Thanks, Brian. And Brian is asking that adding to the length of time that it will take for the economic effects to become apparent, is that COVID will mask the effect of Brexit in the short term. And Brian is wondering if he's being too cynical in seeing that as being advantageous for Boris Johnson.
It's a fantastic pun, Brian. It made me smile. I think swings and roundabouts, to be honest. You're right in that, you know, the impact of Brexit is hidden at the moment because people aren't traveling and there's far less trade than there would be. But the Brexit will go on for longer, in the sense that as we emerge from lockdown, imagine, for instance, that we start emerging from lockdown in early April, just after the grace period for export controls expires for Northern Ireland. And there's a sudden increase in volume as Northern Irish hospitality opens up again. A lot of it is dependent on imports from the United Kingdom. You could end up with a choke point then. So I think the danger is, and I don't know the answer exactly, but it strikes me that the flip side of your argument is that we keep revisiting Brexit. Whenever we open up a bit from the pandemic, as soon as people start flying again, no one realizes yet that it's going to be harder to travel to EU member states, that you're going to be in the other queue. You might be held up for longer. I imagine the French border guards will take great pleasure in minutely inspecting our passports. That's a surprise that is awaiting us rather than something we're realizing now. So I think if I were the Prime Minister at this point, I would be hoping that if it drag on, it doesn't drag on for too long. But I think if in 18 months, 2 years' time, we're still seeing things that we hadn't realized before, saying, oh my God, that becomes damaging because it's far closer to the election. I should just warn you, Mary, there's a question sent directly to me by Isabel, which I'll come to in a minute because I can't read it right now, but that's why it doesn't appear in the chat.
Thanks, Anand. There's a question about the Liberal Democrats from one of our students, I believe, Atakan. asking about whether they might have been better served to push for a second referendum rather than reversing Brexit without that second referendum.
Is there more than that? I mean, you mean if the EU, if the Liberal Democrats hadn't said in 2019, they famously said, if you'll excuse me, it's bollocks to Brexit and we're going to simply revoke rather than go for a referendum. I'm not sure how much difference it would have made, to be honest. I think, you know, one of the striking things about our politics at the moment is the pull of the two-party system, and that was due to a lot of things. On the Leave side, it's fairly simple. The Conservatives aggregated the Leave vote, not least because of the decision of Nigel Farage not to stand in certain seats. On the it might be that the Liberal Democrats could have got more votes doing it that way. I'm not convinced, but it's certainly possible. I think, you know, the ideological polarisation between the Conservatives and the Labour Party meant that voters were going to go to the big parties. There was so much dislike of Boris Johnson and so much dislike of Jeremy Corbyn that things got very, very polarised. It clearly was a tactical mistake of the Lib Dems, I think, to go for the simply revoke rather than have another referendum. I think their larger and more significant tactical mistake was to go for an election at all. And thereby help force Jeremy Corbyn into voting for an election. It struck me that the sensible thing to do for the Remain coalition was to basically hold Boris Johnson captive until you either secured a softer Brexit than the one he was promising the country, or secured another referendum. But of course, the problem with that was that the SNP wanted to defect from that coalition immediately because they had their own reasons, not least the salmon trial, to want to get the election out of the way as soon as possible. So it was very, very difficult to hold that coalition together. Sophie Bolter, I think, is asking about the political realignment that's happened in the north of England in the context of the 2019 general election, and whether you think that's likely to last and to persist. Well, the honest answer, Sophie, is I don't know. It depends. There are so many variables. I mean, if you want a bit of suggested reading, there's a book by Deborah Mattinson based on a lot of focus group work she's done with leavers, with voters in those red wall or blue wall, if you prefer, seats, which is quite interesting as an insight into what these people are thinking. But we're in such an unprecedented moment now. We just don't know how people will judge the Prime Minister coming out of the COVID crisis, whether the accusations of mismanagement leading to a very high death toll will stick. To now, the Prime Minister has done relatively well. I mean, Tories are polling on a par with the Labour Party, which at this stage of a parliamentary term, particularly for a party that has been in power since 2010, is nothing short of remarkable. So a lot will hinge on whether Keir Starmer manages to go beyond being competent and forensic to being appealing to voters. There's no narrative, there's no passion there, I think, which is what some of those voters are after. So I mean, it is the big question. So if you're absolutely right, sadly, I don't know the answer, so I can't help you really. Sorry. There's a question from my colleague Gertrude Cotter in UCC, and it's a question about the impact of Brexit on developing or low-income countries, and what changes in the UK tariff structure that Brexit might bring. Questions about the consequences in terms of access conditions for those countries. Have you any thoughts or insights on that, Anand? I've got a bit of knowledge and a guess. I mean, the guess is, I think the intention always was that you secure closer trading relations with some of them, not least because by cutting tariffs on food imports, you might find alternative sources of stuff that is taking too long to get in from the European Union. So that would be the way I would expect things to develop. However, because the British government was too slow to negotiate a rollover trade deal with Ghana, Ghana is now facing enormous eye-watering tariffs on its bananas and cocoa and suffering as a result. So there have been some immediate negative impacts because of this. I would think, and more particularly, I would hope that this is something that the Foreign Office and the Department for International Trade will deal with quickly. But I think the expectation is that we will lower tariffs to allow those imports in they will lower them from their previous EU level.
Thanks, Anand. There's also a question from my colleague Piers McInerney, who's with the Department of Geography in UCC. Piers, I wonder, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question directly to Anand? It's quite a detailed question. Is he there? No?
Can you hear me now?
Go ahead. Thanks, Piers.
Thank you, and thank you very much indeed, Alan, for a brilliant overview. Well, I've been reading Perry Anderson in the London Review of Books for the last couple of weeks. I'm sure you've seen it too. It's a very detailed, very impressive, very strong critical overview of the whole evolution of the European idea, I suppose, from day one. And he reviews it from several different academic perspectives. But there is a question which he goes through at the heart of his second article, and it's what he says is the absence of a demos in that Greek sense of a political collectivity to which we give our allegiance. And he seems to point to this as a kind of a critical ongoing issue for the EU. And he also makes much, I think, of what he says is the overreach of the European Court of Justice and its decisions. And I suppose what I'm getting at here is that, in a sense, those criticisms are so fundamental that you might say, well, there's kind of no going back in the case of the British, for instance, and Brexit. And there is some legitimacy to them, even though I think his critique is quite vitriolic. I was quite surprised by the time I got to the third section. So I wondered, did you have a view about that particular line of argument? Thank you.
Well, I'm aware of the article. I've got it on my desk, and I sort of keep putting off reading it just because it's so long. To be honest, I mean, there was that strand of argument. That argument in the UK goes back to, it goes back to pre-accession. It goes back to Hugh Gateskill talking about the end of 1,000 years of history. It goes back to Tony Benn talking about democracy being rooted in a people and a parliament. So that's always been present, and there were people who, during the Brexit referendum, argued for Brexit on democratic legitimacy grounds, that the EU was too remote. It didn't, you didn't have the same link with the European Union as you had with your own parliament, that you needed to have a more responsive political system than that the EU represented. And I have a degree of sympathy with all those arguments. And if you listen to we did a podcast last week with Chris Bickerton from Cambridge, who was a Leave supporting academic, who argued very much the same thing. This is because you didn't get democratic legitimacy via the European Union. And, one of the arguments that Brexiters will make is that now we've left, there is nowhere for British politicians to hide. You can't blame the European Union anymore. What happens in the United Kingdom is done by UK politicians, and they will have to carry the can. And if you don't like what they're doing, you can vote them out. I think there are issues with that, not least the fact that this government seems to dislike any sort of constraint, not just the European Union. But yes, it does strike me that, if you listen to people like President Macron, who straight after the Brexit referendum said if we'd had a referendum in France, it might well have gone the same way. I think you can look at this academically and trace input and output legitimacy and all those things, but I think it is absolutely certain that the publics across most of the European Union, at least, don't feel the same way about the European Union as they do about their nation state. It's a different sort of loyalty and a different sort of tie.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Anand. There's a question from Tony Cooney, which is a question, I suppose, that's been rattling around here in Ireland, at least since before the referendum. And George Osborne's piece in the Evening Standard earlier this week was I guess, touching on this as well, about the longer term position of Scotland and Northern Ireland in the UK, if that's threatened by the way in which Brexit is being pursued.
Absolutely, and in a number of different ways. I mean, in terms of Northern Ireland, you've seen a slight shift of public opinion, but there's also how the politics of this plays out, and the fact that the consent mechanism in the protocol means the politics will never go away, because just when you think it's about to go away, it'll start sparking up again before the consent vote. A lot is going to hinge on how well the protocol is made to work. And you've heard that this week in the sort of angry and despairing tones of some unionist politicians. We saw the questioning of Brandon Lewis yesterday about the workings of the protocol, the shortages on shelves, the difficulties with trade. And even though NI to GB trade is meant to be unfettered, of course, one of the problems you have is that lorries going to GB from NI then have to get back with stuff, and so they get held up. So actually, it's affecting the whole circular thing. Ultimately, it's going to hinge on how well that protocol can be made to work. It is in the interest of all parties to make it work. The question is how much flexibility there will be. We will not get back to the status quo ante. So part of this is how well the Northern Ireland manages to lever its position as sort of in the UK, but also in the single market for goods. And only time will tell, but it has added a fragility to that settlement. And I think it is coming to dawn on some in the unionist community that the way they pursued Brexit was not necessarily optimal in terms of their political futures. So there is an issue there. Scotland, more immediate, because of course there's the election that's meant to be in May and might be in May, that we don't know yet. We expect the SNP to win a majority, and it's worth just pondering that the Scottish Parliament was set up deliberately with rules that were meant to exclude the possibility of getting a majority. So it's an amazing achievement to keep getting majorities. Their platform will be, we need another independent referendum. Over the course of the last year, I think there has been there is a stable majority in favour of independence now for the first time. I think the last 22 or so polls have shown a majority yes over no. So yeah, Brexit has changed this. You see in the polling, what has changed is that people who were anti-unionist but pro-EU, anti-independence but pro-EU, have become pro-independence and pro-EU. So Remain voters Remain non-indie supporters have moved to the SNP now as a result of Brexit and the way it has been handled. Now, several roadblocks. One is a roadblock called Boris Johnson. It's up to Boris Johnson whether to allow the authority for a referendum to be held, and all the indications are that at least during the lifetime of this parliament he won't. The second thing, though, is that it is arguable, at least, that the SNP will be, if they have another referendum, it is a referendum that in some ways is held on more unfavourable terms than the referendum of 2014, because if Scotland leaves the United Kingdom and joins the European Union, we will have to have precisely the same conversation as we had with Ireland over the border. There will have to be a customs and regulatory border between Scotland and England, and that's something that I think will be quite a hard sell. One of the lovely, lovely paradoxes of this is you're just starting to hear SNP supporters who were absolutely scathing about the arguments of the Brexiters now starting to say things like, surely we could use technology to solve the border. So you'll find that the arguments used in favour of Brexit are replayed by the most profound opponents of Brexit, because we're now talking about a different thing. But the issue, which is the issue of how you deal with this border, is precisely the same. Can I just answer Eamon? I mean, I said Isabel, but the name at the bottom of the thing is Eamon, just because I said I would. Immigration was absolutely central to the referendum campaign. Absolutely central, and England was absolutely central to the referendum campaign. The biggest chunk of Leave voters were in provincial England outside of London. Having a strong sense of English identity was one of the best predictors of whether or not you'd vote for Leave. So absolutely. Though I should say, even though immigration was central in the referendum, what has happened subsequently is that attitudes to immigration in the UK have become significantly and consistently more liberal than they were back in 2016.
Well, that's interesting. I'm conscious of time, Anand. We have questions piling in for you, but we are coming up on 5 o'clock, and I'm pretty sure that you have other engagements that you need.
I'm going to have my panic attack before question time.
I suppose we should explain that Anand's question time will be from Belfast this evening, and will include, I think, Arlene Foster from the DUP and Michelle O'Neill from Sinn Féin. So hence the nerves, perhaps.
There's two pairings of politicians. So there's those two, and obviously we know about those two, but there's also Brandon Lewis and Louise Haigh, who is his shadow. So I intend to just sit and watch while they, squabble.
Could we ask one more question before?
Yeah, absolutely.
We go? I might ask my colleague, Professor Andrew Cotty, if he'd like to unmute himself and ask his question, which is maybe a bigger question looking forward into the future. In terms of the relationship between Britain and the European Union. Andrew, are you there? Would you like to ask?
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
I can, hiya.
Hi, thank you, and thanks for a fantastic lecture. That was great, and well done, Mary, for organising it. I just wanted to take you to Brussels, really, and just get your take on what does Brussels think about all this now? Where is the Brussels view? I mean, I framed it there as Britain might have to keep reliving Brexit, but is the EU already moving on? Is the EU's policy and attitude likely to be increasingly to view the UK as a minor irritant and not more than that?
I mean, I'd like to think we could be a major irritant, to be honest. But I mean, look, let's be frank. Many EU member states had moved on long before the TCA was signed. You know, whether there are bigger fish to fry, whether it's the sort of migration issues, whether it's the sort of liberal versus anti-liberal spat within the European Union itself, whether it's the budget and where all that money goes and who pays for it, far, far bigger fish to fry than Brexit. So many member states have taken their eye off the ball quite profoundly, I think, which is one of the reasons why the negotiations were so weird in December, because heads of state and government had to be reminded what they were talking about. And the attitude of Brussels now, hardball, very, very clearly hardball. You see this in the reaction to Stefan de Rink, who was the spokesperson for the Article 50 task force, tweeting about the thing about musicians, which has got everyone exercised at the moment, which is, you know, yep, that's just how it is. If you don't accept our mobility chapter, this is what the world looks like. And now it's a question of getting used to living with these new terms in the post-Brexit world. So there's a kind of very polite screw you. This is what you've signed up to. These are the implications. We're not going to revisit stuff unless you move your red lines. Let you deal with the consequence. And, you know, there's absolutely no doubt. And politically, in terms of political realpolitik, I suppose it makes some sort of sense that many people in the European Union, it's very, very different in the Republic of Ireland, obviously, for a whole host of reasons, would quite like the idea of seeing the British government squirm as it faces the consequences of the Brexit deal it's signed, and the implications get rammed home to a number of groups who actually should have known them beforehand, but are now seemingly only just coming to realise. That's a good look from Brussels in the sense that A, it shows them to be tough negotiators, and B, other people, you know, for President Macron, for instance, you can turn around to, you know, Marine Le Pen and say, well, you know, you really want a piece of that sort of action?
Anand, thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed.
My pleasure. I'm sorry I couldn't get through all the questions.
Yeah, we had loads of questions coming in, and perhaps in hindsight we should have elongated the length of time we allocated for questions and answers. But sincere thanks to you for a really fascinating and insightful lecture, and it was surprising as well in a way. I think in some of what we learned from you. I think in particular. It was the divisiveness, I suppose, of the issue, and the way in which it still remains divisive within the UK will be something that we will be interested to watch.
We did some survey work about 18 months ago, and we asked, and it was just trying to find the depth of this, and I think 56% of, this is just from memory, around 56% of Remain voters said they wouldn't rent a room in their house to a Leave voter. And I think it was about 59% of Remain voters said they would be quite or extremely upset if one of their kids married a Leave voter. I mean, this is, you know, this goes deep now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's kind of scary as well when it is that deep. I think particularly when we reflect on it in terms of some of the recent events we've witnessed in places like the United States, you know, that kind of sort of vitriolic dislike of the other is something that we all probably have to watch, and it has application in Ireland as well in many different ways. But thank you enormously for your
absolute pleasure. I'm really sorry I couldn't. I would love to come over at some. Actually, if we leave it long enough, I'm happy to do this again on a sort of update.
Oh, thank you. That would really be fantastic. And we will. I have promised to bring you, and I promise to honour that promise. And it will be great to have you. So I want to thank you sincerely for your time.
At the moment, going to the pub will seem like a summer holiday.
Absolutely.
When that's permitted again.
I'd also like to thank, before we finish, Jean O'Callaghan, who helped with the tech side of things today. Thanks very much, Jean. It was enormously helpful. I do have to thank the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet programme, who have been supporting this event. And just to let all of our audience know that that the next seminar in this series will be delivered in February by Judy Dempsey from Carnegie Europe. And then in March, we actually have Naomi Long, who's leader of the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland. So she'll be talking about Brexit again. And all those details will be either on my Twitter account or on the Department of Government and Politics website. But for now, thanks again to Anand. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Good luck tonight, Anand. It's BBC question time, just to clarify for everyone who's been asking, it's BBC question time tonight. And I'm sure all of us will be tuned in and watching with enormous interest.
No, please don't. That's a horror show.
So thanks again, everyone. Thanks, Anand.
Thank you all.
Have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Anand.
Thanks for your questions. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.